walking. Man, it's really something we take advantage of from the time we're about 1 until the time we can't do it anymore. And if you really want to have a good, kind of a fun day, go to the mall and sit and just watch people. And you'll be amazed at the variations that people will adapt to as they walk, leisurely through the mall. And watch somebody that's in a hurry, and you'll see things that will change. And people that have canes will have different gait patterns. So today we want to take a minute and talk a little bit about what to look for throughout the entire gait cycle. What is it that should happen? What's the functional tasks associated with a normal gait pattern? What are the critical events that we need to look for? And really what deviations may occur if I have changes in joint motion or changes in muscular strength. So the gait cycle can be defined as the point in time from heel strike to the next ipsilateral heel strike. So we're really talking about the point in time when your right heel hits the ground to the next point in time that your right heel hits the ground again. And we can divide the gait cycle into 2 different periods. The stance period, which is the entire period that your limb is in contact with the ground. The swing period begins when your toes leave the ground and exists until your heel comes in contact with the ground at the end of the swing phase. So within each stance and swing phase, we can then look at some other components. And these are what we call the phases of gait. And when I look at the stance versus the swing phases, we'll see that it's not a 50-50 percentage, that we're on the ground longer than our foot is swinging through the air. And one of the things that differentiates walking from running is when you're walking, something is always in contact with the ground. Either one foot or both feet are always in contact with the ground. Where when we're looking at somebody running, there's a point in time of flight. Actually, a foot leaves the ground, both feet are off the ground prior to your leading foot coming in contact again. So when I look at the phases then, the initial contact of the stance phase, and this is a quick review. We're going to go through each one of these in much greater detail. The initial contact is just the moment in time when the foot first contacts the ground. Now, in some texts, you'll see initial contact described as heel strike, and heel strike is a perfectly appropriate, normal heel strike is a perfectly acceptable term to use for that point in time at which your foot first hits the ground. The reason I like to use initial contact, and you'll see more on the west coast of the U.S. That term initial contact used, is with observational gait analysis for abnormal gait, in that some people who have lack of strength in their anterior compartment muscles, their dorsiflexors, lack the ability to clear the toes when at the end of swing phase, and their initial contact occurs with a forefoot contact as opposed to a heel strike. So initial contact is in my opinion, is a little bit better term to describe that point in time when the foot hits the ground. because in some cases it may actually not be the heel strike first. Loading response then is the weight is rapidly transferred onto this outstretched limb, and it's the first period of double limb support. Mid stance, the body's progressing over a single stable limb. So mid stance is 1 foot on the ground and the body is progressing over the top of the foot. Terminal stance is the progression over that stance limb. We continue to progress our center of gravity forward, and the body moves ahead of the limb and the weight is transferred onto the forefoot. Pre-swing is a rapid unloading of the limb, and it occurs as the weight is transferred to the contralateral limb, and it's the second period of double limb support. So initial swing is when the thigh begins to advance as the foot comes off the ground. So now that leg is moving forward. At mid-swing, the thigh continues to advance and the knee begins to extend, and this is where the foot has to clear the ground. At terminal swing, the knee extends and the limb prepares to contact the ground, prepares for initial contact. We really have three primary functional tasks associated with walking. And a functional task is really what's the significance of the gait cycle. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And the first one is weight acceptance. We need to have a satisfactory method at which we can accept the ground reaction force as our weight hits the ground. The second functional task is single limb support. So we need to be able to have a sound ability to maintain support over a single limb. And the last functional task is swing limb advancement. So we need to have an ability to swing the limb forward and advance the limb so that our center of gravity can move forward and we can progress along the sidewalk. So this is kind of how our functional tasks are laid out relative to our stance and our swing and our phases. So again, remember, stance is 62% of the time for our gait cycle. Weight acceptance occurs, our functional task of weight acceptance occurs during initial contact and load and response. Mid stance and terminal stance is the time frame at which we are completing the functional task of single limb support. And as I move into swing limb advancement, those phases include pre-swing, which is still part of stance, although it kind of falls under this swing phase, but this pre-swing is what prepares us to advance the swinging limb. Initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing are the other phases that are included in the functional task of swing limb advancement. So what's happening at the ankle during the gait cycle? And there's a lot going on with this graph, and we're going to go through it kind of section by section here. And we'll start with our top range of motion. And at initial contact, and we can see a nice graphic across the top. Initial contact is that point in time in normal gait when the heel makes contact with the ground. Okay, so the heel makes contact with the ground, and it is literally just a point in time. It's not a amount of time that goes through. It's the instant the foot hits the ground. Everything past that is loading response. So during loading response, our range of motion goes from a neutral position, which is where it is at initial contact, into a plantar flexed direction. So our foot becomes plantar flexed about 5 degrees relative to the tibia. So we can see our tibia is angled posterior, our foot's flat, so we're in a plantar flexed position. As I continue over the top of my foot, I move from a plantar flexed position to neutral, and at mid stance I am now moving into a dorsiflexed position. At terminal stance I continue into a slightly more dorsiflexed position, but you can see how it starts to flatten out as the gastroc soleus group locks the ankle and allows the heel to come off the ground. At pre-swing, my knee collapses, my toes extend, and my ankle rapidly moves into a plantar flexed position. So as my toes leave the ground at the initiation of initial swing, I'm in a plantar flexed position, and as I move through the swing phase, that toe gets moved back up, the foot gets moved back into a neutral position in preparation for initial contact. So that's the range of motion for the ankle as it moves through the gait cycle. So the torque demands that occur are going to kind of mimic the range of motion. So I initially have a plantar flexion torque demand, and that torque demand is going to be offset by my extensor group in tibia anterior. But we will notice that part of what slows down the foot as it moves into that pronated position is my tibialis posterior, the gastroc coming on later, and the soleus coming on at the latter end of the loading response. What's slowing down the foot as it is lowered onto the ground are my pretibials, so tibialis anterior, and we can see that the greatest torque demand is right when the foot hits the ground, extensor digitorum longus, extensor hallucis longus. So these are lowering the foot and the toes down to the ground for the flat foot position. As that foot continues into that pronated position, what is slowing down the rate of pronation is the soleus, a little bit of gastroc, posterior tib, and then later, coming on a little bit later, pronatus longus and pronatus brevis. So when we look at soleus, gastroc, tib posterior, pronatus longus, pronatus brevis, those are all muscles that are going to restrict or retard or slow down tibial progression. So you can see that if I slow down the rate at of progression that my tibia is moving forward, my body can then come over the top of a tibia that is essentially slowed, and that is what helps to control knee flexion. So that becomes those plantar flexors, what we call them plantar flexors, are really responsible for assisting in knee extension as we go from loading response into mid stance. And then they come on to maintain their maximum torque to overcome this torque demand here, which allows the heel to come off the ground. So we can see by our triangle, our black triangle, which is an indication of when we have the peak EMG activity in that muscle occurring as the heel is coming off the ground. So we're now we're locking the foot, turning it back into a rigid lever so that it will help propel us forward. And then we can see at pre-swing, and it's kind of interesting, if we look at what's going on, as my toes come off the ground here, I see a big drop in pre-swing of torque demand. As I have this decrease in change in range of motion, and I look at the muscle action, the muscle activity, I see this kind of, I see this big absence in muscle activity, except for the little tiny bit of this peroneus brevis at the tail end here, maintaining a little bit of muscle activity. But this concept then of push-off with walking really is not supported by EMG activity and by torque demand. So the question is, where do we see this concept of push-off? And I think it's important that we keep in mind the chance that we could have stored energy in a lengthened Achilles tendon that is being released. It could be muscle activity in the hip. So there is some other opportunities that may contribute to that idea of push-off. But from a muscle activation component, we are not seeing it in these plantar flexors in pre-swing. So we've got to be careful if we call that push-off. And then really the primary ankle muscles active through the swing phase become our pretibials again, our tibia anterior, extensor digitorum longus, extensor hallucis longus, to actively dorsiflex, clear the toes, and prepare the foot again for initial contact. So what's happening in the knee? When the knee initiates contact, at initial contact, the knee is essentially straight, essentially 0 degrees. As we move into loading response, we get a little bit of knee flexion, and our knee will flex up to about 20 degrees. So observationally, we can typically see that 20 degrees of knee extension, or the 20 degrees of knee flexion. The challenging part is watching it move through the full range. Essentially, we get that 20 degrees or so of knee flexion so that we can absorb some ground reaction forces, and we can see our torque demand move into that flexion direction. So our knee extensors are really going to come on to counter this demand. As I move into mid stance, my knee starts to move towards back towards that extended position, and it gets to just about 0 degrees at the initiation of terminal stance, and allows us to maintain a fairly straight locked knee, which allows significant decrease in knee extension activity. Now remember, during mid stance and terminal stance, from the ankle perspective, how active the gastroc soleus, posterior tib, all pulling peroneal, all pulling the tibia back into knee extension. So when my quads may not be as active at all during terminal stance, my plantar flexors are really controlling that knee extension position. As I move into pre-swing, I start to see a much greater increase in knee flexion, and knee flexion occurring all the way up into initial swing, where I'll see the greatest amount of knee flexion of upwards of 60 degrees. And as I swing through, my knee starts to straighten until it maximizes the extension range and terminal swing in preparation for initial contact. So when I look at what is happening from a muscular demand perspective, again, at loading and response, we have a large contribution from the quads. Gracilis is also assisting in controlling some of that rotary component. I look at biceps. Biceps are, again, biceps, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Remember we talked about with the hip and the knee, the rotary component of how the hamstrings work, and they're going to work in conjunction, in synergy with the quad muscles in helping to control the extension moment. So it's going to pull the tibia back and assist in tibial rotation. So really important in tibial rotation, transverse plane control of the hamstrings as we look at the demand in load and response as we set the foot up and the leg up for our advancement. Now, as I continue over my knee and my knee locks, I become fairly silent, and we start to see a little bit of activity in the biceps, and moving then into what starts to unlock the knee, and the gracilis, the sartorius, short head comes back on, allows us to flex the knee, and in preparation for moving the swing limb advancement. Now the interesting thing is that my big hamstring muscles are not really active, and that's because gravity is really what's responsible for the knee inflection, and my hip flexors, and we'll talk about here in a second with the hip, as we advance the femur forward, the knee is going to bend, and as the toes leave the ground, we're going to see a little bit of a rectus femoris initiation to kind of kickstart the tibia to advance forward. But then momentum kind of carries it all the way through, and we start to see just at the tail end the quad muscles coming back on to maintain strength in an extended position. But we can also see our hamstrings. So we have knee flexors and knee extensors working not in opposition but in synergy to slow down and stabilize and prepare the heel for initial contact. So the hip then moves through at initial contact, is in about a 20-degree flexed position, and stays there through loading response. So as I move into mid stance, then it isn't until we start to see a shift from that flexed position of a 20 degrees into an extended position, moving into extension all the way through terminal stance, where we see a max hip extension of about 20 degrees. So moving then into pre-swing, and the femur starts to advance forward, we start to see it move back into that flexed position, and at mid stance is when we see it returning to about the 20 degrees of flexed position, staying there all the way through terminal swing until in preparation for initial contact of the next cycle. So as soon as the foot hits the ground, I have a torque demand inflection. So my hip extensors are going to be pretty active to counter this torque demand going into flexion. So you would expect to see gluteus maximus working the adductor magnus working, and all helping to control that femur position. We can see the length of time that tensor fascia lata is active, so the importance of tensor fascia lata on maintaining stability through the entire single limb support phase. So we can see that its muscle activity is probably equally as important in maintaining knee stability as it is in maintaining hip function. We can also see the upper fibers of the gluteus maximus maintaining and the gluteus medius all maintaining muscle activity through the stance phase. Now, we start to see an increase in muscle activity to counter and start the swing limb advancement is in this extended position. Boy, I've really lengthened my hip flexors, so I've really set them up for a good muscular contraction, and which allows me then to really drive the knee forward during swing limb advancement. So you can see the adductors, gracilis, iliacus really coming on to assist in that swing limb advancement. And the gracilis staying on really through the entire swing phase, with initiation of the sartorius through the initiation of the swing. So let's summarize and condense the information that we just reviewed in the previous slides. And I understand there's a lot of information. It can be really confusing, and this summary should help clear up some of the confusion that that you get overwhelmed with when we're looking at the multi-segmental and multi-dimensional approaches of gait analysis. So when at initial contact, you know, our task that we're trying to accomplish is weight acceptance. Or weight acceptance is really occurring at initial contact and at load-in response. And so what we're trying to accomplish during weight acceptance is forward progression, maintaining stability, and having some shock absorption occur. So at initial contact, that point at which the foot strikes the ground, our hips flex to 20 degrees, our hip extensors are active, our knee is straight, maybe flexed to 5 degrees, quads are active, ankles neutral, so it's 0 degrees, and our pretibials are active. And the critical event that we're trying to achieve is heel first contact. When I look at loading response, shock absorption is occurring as we maintain forward momentum, and we're looking for a foot flat position. So the hip is continue to be flexed at 20 degrees. The extensors are still active. The abductors become active to maintain frontal plane stability and transverse plane stability. Knee now flexes to about 15 degrees. The quads are active. That allows some of that shock absorption to occur. We get about 5 degrees of plantar flexion, and the pretibials are still active, lowering that foot down. So the first component of single limb support then is mid stance, and what we're trying to accomplish in single limb support is stability and forward progression. So this is that point where the body progresses over the foot in a nice controlled manner. The contralateral limb is providing the momentum to move us forward. Hips at 0 degrees, the abductors are active, maintaining stability. Knees bent at maybe 5 degrees. Sometimes it'll appear to be straight. Quads are initially active, and then because of the screw home mechanism, they can shut off, and you'll still have stability in the knee. Ankle dorsiflexors are the ankle is dorsiflexed to 5 degrees, and the calf now becomes active in controlling the tibial advancement, and that's the critical event for mid stance, is controlled tibial advancement. So at terminal stance, the body progresses over the forefoot. The hip is in about 20 degrees of extension or apparent hyperextension. There's no muscle activity. The knee is flexed at 5 degrees or close to 0. Again, still no muscle activity. And the ankle dorsiflexes to 10 degrees. And the calf becomes active. And so our critical event then is controlled ankle dorsiflexion with the heel rise, beginning to come off the ground. In pre-swing, that's the first component of swing limb advancement. And what we're trying to accomplish in swing limb advancement is to clear the foot and advance the limb. And again, that limb advancement is what provides the momentum to continually move the center of gravity forward. So pre-swing, the foot remains on the floor, and the knee rapidly flexes as our weight is shifted to the other foot. Hips at 10 degrees of apparent hyperextension. Now the adductors are active. The knee's flexed to 40 degrees. There's no muscle activity in the knee. The ankle's plantar flexed to 15 degrees, again with no muscle activity. So our critical event with pre-swing is passive knee flexion to 40 degrees and active and ankle plantar flexion. So at initial swing, the thigh begins to advance and the knee continues to flex as the foot clears the ground. Hip is at 15 degrees of flexion. The hip flexors are now active, so iliacus, psoas. The knee is bent to 60 degrees of flexion, and the hamstrings begin to become more active, pulling that knee into flexion, preparing some rotation and controlling the rate of the femur. Ankle plantar flexes to 5 degrees or stays at 5 degrees of plantar flexion, and it's moving towards that neutral position. So the pretibials are now active. So the critical event then for the initial swing is hip flexion to 15 degrees and knee flexion to 60 degrees. So mid-swing, the thigh is continuing to advance as the knee starts to extend, and we're clearing the toes through mid-swing. So the hip is now flexed to 25 degrees. Hip flexors are initially active, then the hamstrings are active. The knee is also flexed at 25 degrees. And the knee flexors are slowing down the rate of the tibia swinging through space. Ankle is now neutral. Pretibials are active, maintaining that 0 degree ankle position, or that neutral ankle. The critical event then for mid-swing is that we continue to get further hip flexion at 25 degrees, and our ankle dorsiflexion is 0 degrees, and that's what clears those toes. So at terminal swing, the leg reaches out to achieve maximum step length. The hips at 20 degrees of flexion, hamstrings are active, the knee is at 5 degrees, and the quads become active, and the ankle is at 0, and the pretibial muscles are active. So our critical event then is to get full knee extension and in preparation for initial contact. So that's kind of a summary of what we discussed, and I would encourage everybody to go out and just sit at the mall and watch people walk, and you'll see tremendous variations from one individual to the next based on body type and size and leg length, but keep in mind these critical events and the tasks that are involved with trying to walk. And you can start to see people that have a short calf, their Achilles is short and their heel comes off early and in terminal stance, and that they looks like they have a little hop in their step, or people that have knee pain and don't want to load the patellofemoral joint will minimize the amount of knee flexion in loading response, and so you'll see almost a past retract where they pull their knee back to get off the patellofemoral joint. Or individuals that are lacking adequate hip extension, they'll have a big pelvic rotation, and you'll see their hips, their pelvis rotate from side to side. And those are the people that probably have pretty significant low back pain, where they're rotating off of that lumbar vertebrae. So take a look at and just watch some people and have fun and enjoy the variations that we all have as humans.